There are moments in history that exist only in whispered accounts, in letters burned before they could be read, in testimonies given behind closed doors and never recorded in official documents. The events that unfolded at the Hartwell estate in Albemarle County, Virginia during the spring and summer of 1851 belong to this category of stories, too disturbing to be fully documented, too persistent to be completely forgotten. The first person to mention what happened was a postal clerk named Edgar Hutchins, who noted in a private journal discovered only decades later that he had delivered 3 separate letters to the county sheriff regarding highly unusual circumstances at the Hartwell property. But when researchers later searched the sheriff's records from that year, those letters were nowhere to be found. Someone had removed them, or perhaps destroyed them deliberately. Edgar Hutchins noted in his journal that the sheriff seemed visibly disturbed when receiving the 3rd letter and had asked Edgar directly if he had read the contents. Edgar had not. The letters were sealed, but he noted that the sheriff's hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal. What we do know comes from fragments scattered across decades. A court deposition sealed for 30 years and only opened when all parties involved had died. Entries in a doctor's personal log that was donated to a university archive in 1889, and the haunting consistency of oral accounts passed down through several families, both white and black, who lived in Albemarle County during that time. Each source confirms core details while adding its own disturbing particulars. At the center of it all was a man known simply as Nathaniel. No surname appears in any document, no record of his birth, no mention of parents or origin. He existed in the historical record only as the Negro Nathaniel or Hartwell's Nathaniel, as though his entire identity was defined by his relationship to the man whose death he would predict with such unsettling precision. But before we understand what Nathaniel did, we must understand where he did it and to whom. The Hartwell estate sat on a slight elevation, overlooking the Rivanna River, surrounded by fields that had grown tobacco for 3 generations. The main house was built in 1798 by William Hartwell's grandfather, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, who had claimed the land through a military grant. It was a substantial structure for the region. 2 stories of red brick with white columns flanking the entrance, 6 chimneys rising from a slate roof, and windows that looked out over acres of cultivated land that stretched toward the river in neat, profitable rows. By 1851, the property was managed by William Hartwell, a man of 43 years, who had inherited both the land and its 37 enslaved workers when his father died in 1847. William had not wanted to be a planter. According to letters preserved by his cousin Margaret Daniels, William had hoped to study law in Richmond, had even begun an apprenticeship with a prominent attorney when he was 22. But his father's unexpected death from a riding accident had pulled him back to Albemarle County, back to responsibilities he had not sought but could not refuse. William always seemed like a man living a life intended for someone else, Margaret wrote in 1852, reflecting on her cousin's death. He fulfilled his duties, but without passion. He managed the estate competently, but took no joy in it. He attended to business with precision, but never ambition. It was as though he was simply occupying the role of William Hartwell, plantation owner, while his true self remained somewhere else, unfulfilled and gradually fading. William Hartwell was known in the county as a practical man, neither notably cruel nor particularly kind by the standards of that time and place. He did not participate in the elaborate social life of some plantation owners. He rarely hosted gatherings, attended balls, or involved himself in county politics beyond what was necessary. He kept detailed records, attended church irregularly, and had a reputation for settling his debts promptly. His overseer, Thomas Garrett, would later testify that Mr. Hartwell was fair in his dealings, if distant in his manner. Those who knew him described a man of rigid routine. He rose every morning at 5:00, took breakfast alone at 6:00, inspected his fields from 7 until noon, returned to the house for a simple lunch, spent afternoons reviewing accounts and correspondence, and retired to his study every evening at precisely 8:00, where he would read for 2 hours before bed. This routine varied so little that household staff could set their own schedules by Mr. Hartwell's movements. You could mark time by Master Hartwell. Elizabeth, the Morris, who worked as a cook in the Hartwell house, told her daughter years later, he was like a clock himself, always moving through the same hours in the same way. Some of us used to wonder if he ever felt anything at all, or if he was just going through the motions that were expected of him. Looking back now, knowing what happened, I think maybe he was already disappearing long before he got sick. Maybe Nathaniel saw that before any of us did. Among the enslaved people on the Hartwell property, Nathaniel held an unusual position. He was not a field worker, though he had been one in his youth. By 1851, at approximately 35 years of age, Nathaniel served primarily as a personal attendant to William Hartwell. He prepared the master's clothes each morning, ensured his boots were cleaned, accompanied him on visits to neighboring properties, stood ready during meals to refill glasses or retrieve items, and maintained the study where Mr. Hartwell spent his evenings. But most significantly, and most unusually, Nathaniel could read and write. This literacy was itself an anomaly that required explanation to anyone who learned of it. Virginia law in 1851 strictly prohibited teaching enslaved people to read or write, with substantial fines and even imprisonment for anyone convicted of violating the statute. The law had been strengthened after Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, when fear of literate enslaved people organizing resistance had swept through the slave-holding states. Yet Nathaniel not only possessed these forbidden skills, he possessed them openly, using them in his daily duties. The most common explanation mentioned in several accounts was that William Hartwell's late mother, Catherine Hartwell, had taught Nathaniel when he was a child sometime in the early 1820s, before the laws became more stringent and before the Turner Rebellion had changed attitudes about enslaved literacy. Catherine Hartwell had been known for her religious convictions and had apparently believed that enslaved people should be able to read the Bible. She had taught several enslaved children on the property before her husband discovered what she was doing and forbade it. But by then Nathaniel, who would have been perhaps 8 or 9 years old, had already learned. Whether William Hartwell approved of this education or merely tolerated it as an accomplished fact that predated his own authority, no record explicitly states, but he clearly found Nathaniel's literacy useful. A man who could read and write was valuable for certain tasks that required trust and discretion. What is documented, however, and what would become central to everything that followed, was that William Hartwell had assigned Nathaniel the task of maintaining a household ledger. The assignment was straightforward enough. Nathaniel was to record certain household expenditures in a bound book, purchases made for the main house, inventory of supplies, notes on repairs needed, records of items ordered from merchants in Charlottesville. It was menial clerical work, but it required literacy, and it gave Nathaniel something that most enslaved people never possessed: paper, ink, a legitimate reason to write without arousing suspicion, and hours alone with a book that was ostensibly for household accounts, but could contain anything he chose to write in moments when he was unobserved. Several people who lived through these events mentioned the ledger in their later testimonies, though the ledger itself has never been found. According to these accounts, Nathaniel kept his recordings in a large bound book with a lee. The cover approximately 12 in tall and 9 in wide. Its pages filled with his careful, measured handwriting. The book had been purchased by William Hartwell himself from a stationer in Charlottesville in 1848, intended specifically for household accounting. For the first 2 years, according to Thomas Garrett's testimony, Nathaniel used the ledger exactly as instructed. He recorded expenses, noted deliveries, tracked inventory. Thomas had examined the ledger multiple times during those years as part of his duties as overseer, and he confirmed that it appeared to contain nothing but legitimate household accounts. But sometime in early 1850, Nathaniel began to use the ledger for something else. Elizabeth Morris, who worked as a cook in the Hartwell house, would later tell her daughter, who told her own daughter, who finally shared the story with a historian in 1923, that she had once glimpsed inside this ledger when Nathaniel left it open on a kitchen table in the summer of 1851. What she saw was no longer household accounts. According to Elizabeth's account, passed down through 3 generations, the pages were covered with observations, not opinions or complaints, but simple factual statements written in a peculiar style, each one dated with meticulous precision. March 12, 1851. Master rose at 507 minutes, took 3 full breaths before coughing at breakfast. Cough lasted 4 seconds. Declined second cup of coffee. March 19, 1851. Master's hands trembled when signing correspondence. Tremor lasted 4 seconds, affected right hand only. Master did not appear to notice. March 24, 1851. Master paused twice while climbing stairs, each pause approximately 8 seconds, breathing slightly labored upon reaching top. April 2, 1851. Master dismissed afternoon inspection, stated he felt unwell, retired to his room at 200 instead of 5, did not emerge for dinner. April 14, 1851. Master refused dinner, complained of pressure behind eyes, retired immediately to his room, heard pacing until past midnight. April 19, 1851. Master's complexion appeared grayer in morning light, shadows under eyes more pronounced, ate less than half of breakfast. Row after row, page after page, according to Elizabeth's testimony, a catalogue of observations written in cold, methodical detail. Each entry precise, factual, stripped of any emotional content or interpretation, just pure observation, recorded with the dedication of someone conducting a scientific experiment. Elizabeth told her daughter that she had felt a chill reading those lines, even in the warm kitchen. It was like looking at a list of symptoms, she said. Like the kind of thing a doctor might write down, except there was something about the way Nathaniel had recorded it all. So patient, so thorough, so deliberate that made it feel like something else. Like he wasn't just noticing these things, like he was waiting for them. When Elizabeth had looked up from the ledger, she found Nathaniel standing in the doorway watching her. He did not speak, did not reproach her for reading his private writings. He simply stood there holding her gaze until she carefully closed the book and stepped away from the table. "You understand what you saw?" Nathaniel asked her quietly. Elizabeth, frightened now, shook her head. "I am watching," Nathaniel said simply. "Someone needs to watch. Someone needs to see what is happening, even if no one else notices, especially if no one else notices." "Why?" Elizabeth whispered. "Because it matters that someone knows," Nathaniel replied. "Even if only one person knows. Even if they can do nothing about it, it matters that the truth is seen and written down. That is why I watch. That is why I record." He took the ledger from the table, tucked it under his arm, and left the kitchen. Elizabeth never spoke to him about it again. Not until after everything that followed had already happened. But why Nathaniel kept such records, why he had chosen to observe William Hartwell with such obsessive attention to detail, remained one of the central mysteries. And what happened next would transform these strange notations from mere curiosity into something far more unsettling. The morning of May 3rd, 1851 began like any other morning at the Hartwell estate. The sun rose at 23 minutes 500. Workers moved toward the fields in the cool dawn air. In the main house, Elizabeth Morris prepared breakfast, while Nathaniel laid out William Hartwell's clothes for the day and ensured his study was prepared for the afternoon's work. William Hartwell came down to breakfast at precisely 600, as was his custom. He took his usual seat at the head of the dining table. Nathaniel stood by the sideboard, ready to serve. Elizabeth brought in the food: eggs, ham, biscuits, coffee, everything as it had been in 1,000 mornings before. It was during this ordinary breakfast that William Hartwell made his announcement. "I will travel to Richmond on May 9th, he said, speaking to no one in particular, as he often did at breakfast. The Richmond merchants need to finalize contracts for this year's tobacco crop. I expect to be gone for 5 days, returning on the 13th or 14th. Thomas, you will oversee operations in my absence." Thomas Garrett, who was present for the morning's instructions, he often joined Mr. Hartwell for breakfast to discuss the day's work, nodded his acknowledgement. "Yes, sir. Everything will be maintained." According to Thomas Garrett's deposition, given under oath 6 months later in October of 1851, what happened next occurred so quickly and so unexpectedly that he initially thought he had misheard. Nathaniel, who had been standing motionless by the sideboard, as he always did, spoke. "Master will not make that journey." The words hung in the air. William Hartwell looked up from his breakfast. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. Thomas Garrett turned to stare at Nathaniel. Even Elizabeth Morris, who was returning to the kitchen, stopped in the doorway. William Hartwell set down his fork carefully. His expression was not angry, Thomas testified, but surprised. Nathaniel almost never spoke unless directly addressed, and certainly never contradicted his master. "What did you say?" Mr. Hartwell asked. His tone was neutral, genuinely curious. "You will not travel to Richmond, sir," Nathaniel repeated. His voice, according to Thomas's testimony, was flat and factual, as though he were reading an entry from his ledger. "The journey will not occur." William Hartwell stared at Nathaniel for a long moment. Thomas Garrett later stated that he expected Mr. Hartwell to become angry at this presumption, to demand what right a slave had to make such a statement. But instead, William Hartwell did something that Thomas found remarkable enough to mention specifically in his testimony. He asked a follow-up question. "Why would you say such a thing?" Nathaniel met his master's gaze directly. Another unusual behavior that Thomas noted. "Because it is true, sir. I have observed that you will not make this journey." Observed. William Hartwell's tone shifted slightly, not to anger, but to something closer to confusion. "What do you mean observed?" "I have been watching, sir. I've been recording what I see, and what I see tells me that you will not travel to Richmond in 6 days. Thomas Garrett testified that the silence that followed was deeply uncomfortable. William Hartwell continued to stare at Nathaniel, who stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, his expression neutral. Finally, Mr. Hartwell spoke again. "You are being presumptuous." "No, sir. I am being factual. You cannot know whether I will make this journey or not." "I can, sir, I do." William Hartwell picked up his fork again, though Thomas noted he did not actually eat anything. "We will see about that," he said quietly. "You are dismissed." Nathaniel bowed slightly and left the dining room, taking the household ledger, which he had been carrying tucked under his arm, as he often did with him. After Nathaniel left, Thomas Garrett testified. William Hartwell sat in silence for several minutes, not eating, not speaking, just staring at his plate. Finally, Thomas felt compelled to break the silence. That was strange behavior, sir. Shall I speak to him about overstepping his bounds? William Hartwell shook his head slowly. No, leave him be. He paused, then added something that Thomas found odd enough to air. Remember verbatim. I want to see if he is right. Thomas did not understand what his employer meant by that statement. At the time, he assumed it was merely an expression that Mr. Hartwell wanted to prove Nathaniel wrong, to demonstrate that the journey would indeed occur, despite the slave's bizarre pronouncement. But looking back, Thomas would later testify. He wondered if William Hartwell had meant something else entirely. Perhaps he wanted to see if Nathaniel was right, because some part of him already suspected that the statement was true, that something was wrong in ways he had not yet admitted to himself. 3 days later, on the morning of May 6th, William Hartwell woke with severe pain in his abdomen that made it impossible for him to leave his bed, much less travel to Richmond. Dr. Marcus Sullivan maintained a medical practice in Charlottesville, approximately 8 miles from the Hartwell estate. He served several prominent families in Albemarle County and had known William Hartwell since William was a child. Dr. Sullivan's personal medical log from 1851, now housed in the archives of the University of Virginia, contains detailed entries about William Hartwell's condition, written in the precise scientific language typical of mid-9th century physicians. The first entry regarding William Hartwell's illness, dated May 6, 1851, reads, "Called to Hartwell Estate at 10:00 this morning. Found patient in bed, conscious and coherent, but in considerable distress. Symptoms present: severe cramping in lower abdomen, inability to retain food or water, profuse sweating despite relatively cool temperature in room, pulse elevated at 96 beats per minute, pupils slightly dilated, skin color slightly ashen. Patient reports pain began suddenly upon waking approximately 500 this morning. No fever detected. Initial diagnosis, acute indigestion, possibly early cholera, though no reports of cholera in the county at present. Administered laudanum for pain. Recommended clear broth only, no solid foods. Will return tomorrow to assess progress." Dr. Sullivan did return the following day and the day after that. His log entries trace the progression of William Hartwell's condition with clinical detail. May 7th, patient's symptoms have partially subsided, cramping less severe, able to retain small amounts of water, pulse normal at 72, color slightly improved, cautiously optimistic, continue resta, eated diet. May 8th, patient reports feeling markedly better, no cramping, appetite returning, examined thoroughly, found no indication of serious disease, suspect acute digestive upset perhaps from spoiled food, now resolved. Patient expresses desire to resume normal activities. Advised gradual return to regular diet and activities over next few days. William Hartwell did not travel to Richmond. The journey was postponed, then quietly cancelled. Thomas Garrett sent word to the Richmond merchants that Mr. Hartwell had been unwell and would need to reschedule the meeting for later in the summer. And Nathaniel, according to multiple testimonies, said nothing at all about his prediction having come true. He continued his usual duties, silent and attentive, as though he had never made any unusual pronouncement. When Elizabeth Morris saw him in the kitchen the day after Mr. Hartwell fell ill, she asked him directly, "How did you know Master would get sick?" Nathaniel looked at her with those calm, unreadable eyes and said simply, "I did not know he would get sick. I knew he would not make the journey. That is all I said. That is all I knew, but it's the same thing," Elizabeth protested. "Is it?" Nathaniel replied and walked away before she could respond. Dr. Sullivan visited the Hartwell estate 3 more times during the following week. His notes indicate growing confidence that Mr. Hartwell had recovered from whatever had ailed him. By May 14th, Dr. Sullivan wrote, "Patient much recovered. Resume normal diet without incident. Color good. Pulse normal. Energy returning. No indication of chronic condition. Suspect entire episode was acute digestive disruption. Unpleasant, but not serious. Patient may resume full normal activities. William Hartwell did resume his normal routine. He returned to his morning inspections of the fields. He took meals at his regular hours. He worked in his study every evening from 8 until 10:00. To all outward appearances, he had completely recovered from whatever had briefly laid him low. But something had changed, though it would take several more days for anyone to fully recognize what it was. William Hartwell had begun to watch Nathaniel the way Nathaniel watched him. Thomas Garrett noticed it first. In a letter to his brother in North Carolina, written on May 20th and preserved in family papers, Thomas described the shift in his employer's behavior. Mr. Hartwell has become oddly preoccupied with his servant, Nathaniel. He watches the man constantly, follows his movements around rooms, asks him questions about trivial matters as though testing him. Yesterday, I observed Mr. Hartwell staring at Nathaniel for several minutes while the man was arranging books in the study. When I asked if something was wrong, Mr. Hartwell seemed startled as though he had not realized he was staring. He said only he knew Thomas. He said I would not make the journey, and he was correct. How did he know? I suggested it was mere coincidence. The man made a guess that happened to be accurate. But Mr. Hartwell shook his head and said, "It was not a guess." You heard how he said it. He spoke with certainty, as though he could see something I could not. I did not know how to respond to that. Elizabeth Morris observed the same phenomenon from her position in the household. She later told her daughter that Mr. Hartwell began finding excuses to be in rooms where Nathaniel was working, watching him perform simple tasks, polishing boots, dusting shelves, preparing the master's clothes for the day. It was like Master Hartwell was trying to figure something out, Elizabeth recalled, like he was studying Nathaniel the way you might study a puzzle or a strange animal you'd never seen before. And Nathaniel, he just went about his work like nothing was different. But I could tell he knew he was being watched. Of course he knew. Nathaniel always knew everything that was happening around him. On the evening of May 16th, approximately 10 days after his illness had begun, William Hartwell called Nathaniel into his study. This in itself was not unusual. Nathaniel was frequently in the study attending to his duties. But what happened that evening, according to testimony from Margaret Ashby, a housemaid who overheard the conversation from the hallway, was unlike any previous interaction between master and servant on the Hartwell estate. Margaret Ashby was 23 years old in 1851. She had worked in the Hartwell house since she was 15, brought there from a neighboring property, when William Hartwell's father was still alive. In 1889, when she was in her 60s and had been free for more than 20 years, she gave a statement to Reverend James Henley, a minister who was collecting oral histories from formerly enslaved people in Virginia. Her account of what she heard that evening in May 1851 was remarkably detailed, preserved in Reverend Henley's notes, which are now part of the collection at Hampton University. According to Margaret's testimony, she was walking past the study to bring fresh linens upstairs when she heard Mr. Hartwell's voice raised slightly, not shouting, but speaking more loudly than usual with an edge of frustration. "I want to understand," Mr. Hartwell was saying. "You said I would not make the journey." 3 days later, I fell ill. The timing cannot be coincidental. Margaret paused in the hallway. She knew she should not eavesdrop, but something in Mr. Hartwell's tone stopped her. He sounded not angry, but almost pleading, desperate to understand something. Nathaniel's voice, when he replied, was as calm and measured as always. "I did not make you ill, sir. I only observed that you would not travel. How? The word came out sharply. How did you observe that? I watched, sir. I have always watched. Watched what? You, sir. I watch you. There was a pause. Margaret testified that she could hear papers rustling, as though Mr. Hartwell was fidgeting with documents on his desk. Then his voice came again, quieter, now, but more intense. What do you mean, you watch me? In what way? I observe your patterns, sir. Your behaviors, your habits, the small changes that others do not notice. What changes? Everything changes, sir. Every day brings small shifts. Most people do not pay attention to them, but I do. Another pause. Then Mr. Hartwell asked the question that Margaret remembered most clearly. The question that made her skin prickle. Are you watching me now? At this moment, yes, sir. I am always watching. And what do you see? Margaret stated in her testimony that Nathaniel's pause, before answering, was longer this time, perhaps 5 or 6 seconds. When he spoke, his words were carefully chosen. I see a man who is afraid, sir. A man who wants answers to questions he has not yet fully formed. A man who suspects something is wrong, but cannot name what it is. A man who looks at me and wonders if I am his enemy or his witness. Which are you? I am your witness, sir. I see you. I record what I see. That is all. Show me, sir. Show me what you have recorded. I know you keep that ledger. I've seen you carrying it constantly. Show me what you have written. Have. Margaret testified that she heard footsteps. Pass then, and she quickly moved away from the door, hurrying toward the stairs with her linens. She did not want to be caught listening. But as she climbed the stairs, she looked back and saw Nathaniel standing in the study doorway, the leather-bound ledger in his hands, watching her go. His expression, she said, was not accusatory or angry. It was simply aware. He knew she had been listening, and he did not care. What happened after that? What William Hartwell saw when he looked through Nathaniel's ledger, that evening would become central to everything that followed. Dr. Marcus Sullivan happened to be visiting the Hartwell estate on May 17th, the day after William Hartwell had demanded to see Nathaniel's ledger. The visit was routine. Dr. Sullivan wanted to check on his patient's recovery and ensure that the illness had truly passed. What he found, instead, was William Hartwell sitting in his study, the leather-bound ledger open before him on the desk, staring at its pages with an expression that Dr. Sullivan described in his medical log as profound disturbance. Dr. Sullivan's entry from that day is longer than most, suggesting that what he witnessed affected him deeply. May 17, 1851, visited Hartwell estate for follow-up examination. Found patient in study, not ill, but visibly shaken. Upon inquiry, patient showed me a ledger kept by his servant Nathaniel. The contents are extraordinary and deeply unsettling. The ledger appears to have been intended for household accounts, and the first many pages do contain such records: expenses, inventory, repairs. But starting approximately in early 1850, the entries change in nature entirely. What follows are pages upon pages of observations about Mr. Hartwell himself. Not opinions or narratives, but factual notations of remarkable specificity. The time he rises each morning, recorded to the minute. The duration of his breakfast. The number of times he coughs. The moments when his hands tremble. The days when he climbs stairs more slowly than usual. The nights when he paces in his room. The meals he leaves unfinished. The times when he pauses in his speech or loses focus during conversation. I reviewed more than 50 pages of such entries, dating back over a year. The level of detail is extraordinary. This man, Nathaniel, has been watching his master with the intensity of a physician conducting a clinical study. But it is more than clinical observation. There is something deeply unsettling in the accumulated weight of these notations. As though one is reading a chronicle of slow deterioration written, by someone who sees every tiny symptom as it emerges, long before the patient himself notices anything wrong. Most disturbing, I compared Nathaniel's observations to my own medical notes from visits to Mr. Hartwell over the past year. The servants' observations correlate precisely with symptoms I had noted, but dismissed as trivial or temporary. Occasional digestive complaints, mild fatigue. Moments of what I attributed to distraction, but which Nathaniel recorded as loss of focus lasting 7 seconds, or difficulty following conversation thread. Nathaniel saw patterns in symptoms I had treated as isolated incidents. When I asked Mr. Hartwell how long Nathaniel had been keeping these records, he said he did not know. He had only just discovered them yesterday. When I asked the servant himself what purpose these observations served, Nathaniel replied, "To see the pattern, sir. Everything has a pattern." I watched Master Hartwell to see his pattern. I asked if he maintained such records about others. He said, "No, sir. Only Master Hartwell requires this attention." I asked what he meant by requires this attention. Nathaniel's answer, "Everyone should be truly seen at least once in their life, sir. Most people never are. I see Master Hartwell completely. Every detail, every change I bear witness to his existence. I confess I do not know what to make of this. The servant has committed no crime that I can identify. He has not harmed his master. Yet there is something in this level of observation, this exhaustive documentation of another person's life that feels like a violation, even if it breaks no law. To be watched so completely, to have every tiny detail of one's existence recorded by someone who sees patterns you do not see yourself. Is this not a form of power? And if so, what does it mean when a slave holds such power over his master? Dr. Sullivan's log entry concludes with a note that would prove prophetic. Mr. Hartwell asked me if I thought his servant could predict the future. I told him no. Prediction and observation are different things. But as I left the estate, I found myself troubled by a thought. If someone watches you closely enough, records every tiny change, sees patterns you do not see, does that grant them a kind of knowledge that feels like prediction? And if they speak that knowledge aloud, does the very act of speaking it change what happens next? I do not know, but I am disturbed by the question. After William Hartwell examined Nathaniel's ledger, the dynamic between master and servant shifted in ways that everyone in the household noticed. Mr. Hartwell could not seem to stop thinking about what he had read. He asked Nathaniel questions constantly, not angry questions, but probing, almost desperate inquiries. When did you first notice something wrong? What made you start recording these observations? Do you see a pattern in other people or only in me? Why me? Why have you watched me so carefully? Nathaniel answered each question with the same calm, measured tone, giving information, but never quite satisfying his master's need for understanding. According to Thomas Garrett's testimony, Mr. Hartwell's preoccupation with the ledger and with Nathaniel's observations began to interfere with his normal routines. He would sit in his study for hours, reading and rereading the entries, sometimes calling Nathaniel in to explain what a particular notatio and meant. May 8, 1850. Master hesitated 3 seconds before mounting horse. Right hand gripped saddle horn with more force than usual. What did that mean? Why was it significant? June 14, 1850. Master took 4 attempts to sign name on letter, ink blot on 3rd attempt. Hand coordination appeared impaired. Had William Hartwell been drunk? No, Nathaniel assured him. He had consumed no alcohol that day. Then what explained the impaired coordination? September 2nd, 1850. Master complained of headache for 3rd time this week. Held hand to temple for extended periods. Facial expression suggested significant pain. William Hartwell remembered none of these headaches. Had they really been so frequent? Page after page, entry after entry. Nathaniel had recorded details that William Hartwell had experienced but not consciously registered. Symptoms he had felt but immediately forgotten. Changes in his own body and behavior that he had not considered significant enough to remember. And now, seeing them all accumulated, in one place arranged chronologically with obsessive precision, William Hartwell was confronted with a picture of himself that he had never seen, a man gradually, almost imperceptibly declining. It was like Master Hartwell was reading the story of his own death before it happened. Elizabeth Morris told her daughter, and Nathaniel was the one who had written that story, even though he swore he was just writing down what he saw, not making it happen. On the evening of May 22nd, 2 weeks after his illness and 6 days after first examining the ledger, William Hartwell called Nathaniel into his study once again. This time, according to testimony from multiple people who were in the house that night, the conversation lasted for more than 2 hours. Margaret Ashby, the housemaid, who had previously overheard conversations between master and servant, testified that she and Elizabeth Morris had both paused outside the study door at various points that evening, drawn by the intensity of Mr. Hartwell's voice. Master was asking Nathaniel to tell him the truth, Margaret recalled. He kept saying, "I need to know the truth. All of it. What you see when you look at me, what the pattern tells you." And Nathaniel, he kept saying the same things. "I see what is there, sir. I record what I observe. The pattern shows what it shows." But Master Hartwell wasn't satisfied with that. He wanted more. He wanted Nathaniel to tell him something specific, though what it was we couldn't quite hear clearly. Elizabeth Morris's account of that evening, given separately, but corroborating Margaret's testimony, added one crucial detail. "I heard Master Hartwell raise his voice, not in anger, but like a man who is desperate and afraid, and he said loud enough that I heard clearly, 'Do you see my death coming? Is that what your pattern shows you? Am I dying?' And there was this long, long silence. I stood there in the hallway, holding my breath, waiting to hear what Nathaniel would say. And when he finally spoke, his voice was so calm, so matter-of-fact that it made my blood run cold. He said, 'Yes, sir. The pattern has been showing your death approaching for many months now. It is clearer with each week that passes.' Elizabeth stated that she heard rapid movement after that. The sound of Mr. Hartwell's chair scraping across the floor, footsteps, heavy breathing. Then Mr. Hartwell's voice louder now. 'Get out. Get out of this room right now.' But Nathaniel, according to Elizabeth, did not immediately leave. There was no sound of footsteps, no sound of the study door opening, just silence. Then Mr. Hartwell's voice again, not shouting, but somehow more terrible for its quiet intensity. I said, 'Leave. Take your ledger and your observations and your patterns, and get out of my sight.' It was only then that Elizabeth noticed the sound of approaching footsteps. Nathaniel stepped out of the study, a leather-bound ledger tucked beneath his arm. Elizabeth and Margaret, who had been lingering in the corridor, instinctively flattened themselves against the wall as he walked past them. Both women later swore that Nathaniel's face showed no trace of triumph, fear, anger, or satisfaction. It was vacant and composed, an expression of a man who had merely finished a necessary duty. Once Nathaniel disappeared down the hall, Elizabeth and Margaret heard muffled sounds drifting from the study. Sounds that left little doubt that Mr. Hartwell was crying. By sunrise the next day, the entire Hartwell estate knew. Enslaved workers in the fields and servants inside the house whispered the same words. Nathaniel had told Master Hartwell that his death was coming. The story moved quickly, carried from cabin to cabin, spreading through the enslaved community like a quiet, undeniable truth. If you enjoy dark, mysterious historical stories like this, Make sure to like subis IB to our channel Black Rite Stories. Watching from United States. Your support helps bring these forgotten histories to life.